Technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. Now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and just want to thank Liberty for sitting in yesterday to do the roundtable, but we now have throughout the rest of this week all sorts of things to cover, including the fact that just a few hours from now, the government technically will shut down. I will go into some of the details of what a government shutdown is like. This is not our first rodeo, as they like to say in West Texas. We've been here before, but I do want to help you understand maybe some of the things happening behind the scenes. And so we'll try to cover that. Then we'll get into some really important questions that over the weekend, for example, we found out, for example, that there were 274 plainclothes FBI agents at the U.S. Capitol riot on January 6th. What? And I think there's now a little better understanding for that. We have, of course, in Chicago, two ICE rioters carrying guns, and also some back and forth between ICE agents and federal agents in Portland, Oregon. We'll get into all of those details, and then we'll be looking at a very significant book in the second hour. But let's, if we can, remind you that the federal government's fiscal year ends on September 30th. If you look at your calendar, that's today. At midnight, unless the Senate does something which I know it's not going to do, we then go into October 1st, the new fiscal year for the federal government, without any funding. Now you might say, well, why is that? Well, go back to your Constitution, and that is that governments are funded by the House of Representatives ultimately, and thus also have to be ratified by the Senate, signed by the President. So spending bills begin there. The House has done their job. They passed what's called a clean continuing resolution, a CR. Clean meaning nothing has been added to it. It's just extending the same amount of funding into this new fiscal year. And it only gets you to the end of the year, but at least gets you a little further along. But the Senate needs, of course, enough votes to make that happen, and that means you have to have at least 7 Democrats to vote with the 53 Republicans because of cloture and filibuster and all of the rest. So it is quite clear that starting at midnight tonight, the government will not be funded. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you've been down this road with us before, and I'm sure you have, first of all, members of Congress will still be paid. Why is that? That goes to the 27th Amendment, and U.S. Capitol Police and security operations will also be in the job, although their pay will come later. Transportation Security Administration agents and air traffic controllers must continue working. We had a near miss at LAX. I don't know if any of you saw that. Boy, that was a near miss on the ground, but nevertheless could have been devastating. So they will continue to work without pay. Now, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid will continue to run, even though it is possible some services will be cut back. If you call up your Social Security office tomorrow, probably the phone will ring for a very long time. Veteran services will continue, though services outside the health system may be delayed. And then when you get into some of the other things, which are part of what we call our safety net, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, or best called food stamps, will continue. But, you know, if this goes on for any length of time, and we have had one shutdown that went 35 days, that would then have an impact there as well. So you might say, well, what is shut down? Well, also so-called non-essential activities. If you are in Washington, D.C. and want to get a tour of the Capitol, you're out of luck. The flag operation that takes place where they raise and lower the American flag, that'll be suspended. Restaurants, barbershops in the Capitol will be closed. Garbage won't be collected. National parks will be closed. And, of course, any number of non-essential individuals will not be called back to work. I will get to that in just a minute, but you might say, well, why is it that when we had one of these possible shutdowns in March, did the Senate Minority Leader at that time, Chuck Schumer, go along? Well, because he didn't see the point in fighting. But this is a new day, and he's really being pushed now by some of the people, primarily sort of the left side of the Democratic Party, to actually show that they're willing to fight Donald Trump. And so he is putting some pressure on, and I think it would be difficult to come up with 7 Democrats in the Senate right now that would want to go against Chuck Schumer. And the argument being made, and it isn't a great one, but let's at least give credit where credit is due, they are trying to argue why they wouldn't want to continue funding the government. They say they want to pressure Republicans on the issue of health care. Turns out that when President Joe Biden was in office, remember we had COVID, we had the pandemic, we had the lockdown. Joe Biden was able, especially through the Democratic-controlled Congress, to increase subsidies during especially the pandemic and lockdown on Obamacare because they were arguing about some of the premiums skyrocketing, because they were. I'm not denying that. And these would continue till the end of this year, 2025. Now, you've had all sorts of people from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to the President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying, look, let's keep funding the government, and before year's end, we will address this issue. I might, in a future program, even try to explain why even some of those subsidies make no sense, but we'll leave that as it is. And so the real issue isn't necessarily the issue of whether or not we can or cannot fund Obamacare subsidies, because we have months for that to take place, a full 3 months, October, November, and December for that to take place. But it's an attempt to show that we, quote, can, that is, Democrats can fight Donald Trump. And the hope is, interestingly enough, on the part of the Democrats, that they can use the media to actually argue that it's the Republicans' fault because they are actually preventing us from addressing an issue of health care. And you will hear a number of people that will make a case that this was a partisan bill that was passed in the House. That is completely incorrect. Matter of fact, it's a deliberate lie, because anybody that's been around Washington knows that this is what is called a clean bill. What do we mean by that? Nobody's added any ornaments on the Christmas tree here. This is simply a bill to continue funding government at the rate it was funded in September. But that would then continue into October or November and on. And so the bottom line is it's a clean bill. It's not a partisan bill. It is the kind of bill that oftentimes Democrats, when they were in control, would pass. And most always the Republicans would go along with that. So the bottom line is, if indeed we do see a government shutdown tomorrow, that brings me to my first article, which we'll talk about after the break, and that is the Office of Management and Budget actually has said, well, if we have to send workers home, we'll just tell them to stay home permanently. And so we'll get into that very interesting wrinkle that has really never been put forward before, but will be something we'll talk about right after these important messages. If you'd like to find some of the material that we're talking about today, of course, it's on the website, pointofview.net, and we'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for more than a decade, policymakers have been discussing the problem of food deserts. I started writing about this issue 3 years ago because there are zip codes of low-income neighborhoods without a grocery store that can provide fresh and nutritious food options. Dr. Merrill Matthews recently wrote about this issue and was on my radio program to discuss it. He reminds us that the major food chains like Walmart, Kroger, and Whole Foods have announced that they are leaving some major urban areas. Of course, we've also seen other retail outlets that don't sell food that are also leaving those same crime-ridden areas. The explanation is simple. They have become bastions of progressivism. Crime is on the increase because shoplifters and other criminals aren't punished. Record levels of unchecked theft and crime make the stores unprofitable. So let me add my perspective to his observation. Food deserts are a real problem, and wokeness, and especially critical race theory, make the problem worse. In a recent speech I gave in the Dallas area, I started with the economic fact that it takes $12 million to plant a grocery store in the region, and the risks are high given the limited profit margins. In 2 cities in which I've lived, the local grocery store went broke and closed. When a food chain announces that it will locate a grocery store, there are the inevitable charges of racism. A white grocery chain will put local black convenience stores out of business. Once it is built, the food chain must hire law enforcement to stop shoplifting and smash and grab. Again, you hear the charges of racism. And if only a few people are hired from the community, once again, you hear the charges of racism. So food deserts are a real problem, but I suggest that the current political, economic, and cultural issues aren't making it easier to solve the problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about the shutting down of the U.S. government. And I can relate to this because when I came in today, our internet was shut down. Now, it turns out that if you've been out on the news, the whole country of Afghanistan's internet is shut down, which illustrates, again, how centralized some things probably in Afghanistan are. It is really not possible, though you hear conspiracy theorists all the time saying, well, there's an off switch, so they could just shut down the internet for the entire United States. No, don't think so. That's not going to happen because of the way it was designed to be decentralized in the first place. But, you know, you look around and go, did we just not pay our light bill? I suspect it has to do with some of the construction taking place in this building. Could even be a squirrel that chewed through a wire. We do not know. But anyway, internet is back up. But I'm very clear that we will not be up anytime soon in terms of the federal government. And this is where now you see Democrats actually involved in a high wire act because, and go to the first article, this is by Kimberly Strassel, we've had her on the program before. She's talking about Russ Vought, who, by the way, used to be on the program with some regularity, but now he's the head of Office of Management and Budget. And so he has made it very clear that if indeed you, Democrats, are going to shut down the government, then we're not just going to, in some cases, merely furlough federal employees and suffer the temporary inconvenience of not having to work, although I think most of them enjoy that break, and then resume in their jobs. If you look at the memo by Russ Vought, and again, he's been on the program with us, a graduate at Wheaton College and all the rest, orders agencies to identify all programs that depend on discretionary spending and funding, which of course now is going to lapse, and don't align with the president's priorities, and then just give the individuals that are running those programs the possibility of closing down those disfavored programs and projects. Put bluntly, they will be fired. So we've never quite seen anything like this before. Now, the possible targets for that would be the Economic Development Administration, the U.S. Agency Council on Homelessness, and then the Legal Services Corporation. For some of you that have been listening to Point of View for decades, you might remember when Marlon Maddox used to bring on Howard Phillips to talk about the need to close down the Legal Services Corporation because it was actually working against the values and priorities of the Reagan administration, even before that, the Nixon administration, later the Bush administration, but nevertheless. And of course, there could even be the shutdown ultimately of the education department. So there we are anyway. And so you can see that these other programs, which we mentioned a minute ago, they're going to continue on. Social Security, Medicare, military operations, veterans benefits, border security, air traffic control, on and on and on. So the bottom line is, don't first of all be fooled by having somebody in the media or some of your friends saying this was a partisan bill passed by the House. No, it was. It's a clean CR, a continuing resolution, the kind that have been used for years. And don't be fooled by the idea that this is going to interrupt your ability to receive your Social Security benefits or something of that nature. But again, I love what Kimberly Strassel says at the end. All the onus rests on Chuck Schumer, since it will take Senate Democrats' votes to keep government running. She says, don't be fooled. He knows well what a horrible idea the shutdown is. In March, he argued that to close the government would be a gift to the White House, since it would give Donald Trump carte blanche to destroy vital government services at a significantly faster rate, and also give to Russ Vought the keys to the city, state, and country. So anyway, this is a very good article. Matter of fact, next week when I'm in Oregon, I actually drive right by where she was born in Oregon, and she is certainly one of those very outstanding writers at the Wall Street Journal, and I thought you would find that article helpful. And we will, for the next couple of days, try to follow what will happen. I'm hoping that certainly by the time we do our Friday weekend edition, some kind of sanity will have actually reached the minds of at least 7 Democrats in the United States Senate, but I don't see anything happening between now and midnight tonight. And if it does, well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. As a matter of fact, when I wasn't sure that we were going to be able to do a program today, since we didn't have internet, I was already busily putting together the articles for tomorrow because I knew we wouldn't get to all of them today anyway, and I knew we wouldn't get to any of them if the internet shut down. So we'll probably have more opportunity to cover some of those tomorrow. But let's, if we can, mention one other article that I've posted, because again, when the FBI or the Justice Department or the Treasury Department or even the President of the United States is not forthcoming, that's when the conspiracy theories begin to run wild. And here's one of those. Over the weekend, if you were in the news cycle at all, you heard that there were 274, some people said 275, I'm not going to quibble about one or two, FBI plainclothes agents that were in the crowd on January 6th. Now, you had all sorts of people saying, well, then the Bureau was actually trying to foment some of the disruption. And I think there's some scant evidence that that was the case. But it is interesting that we no longer are talking about FBI Director Chris Wray, but we're talking about FBI Director Kash Patel. And I think he's a pretty straight shooter. And so this is why the FBI felt that it really needed to address this issue, that while there were agents on hand, they were sent in after the riot had begun to try to control the unruly crowd. That's the argument being made. That is, of course, not the proper role of FBI agents, so I think there's still some congressional testimony that needs to take place. But if I can quote from Kash Patel, here's what he said. Quote, agents were sent into a crowd control mission after the riot was declared by the Metro Police, something that goes against FBI standards, unquote. A little bit later, he said, quote, this was the failure of a corrupt leadership that lied to Congress and to the American people about what really happened. Went on to say, thanks to agents coming forward, we're now uncovering the truth, and we're fully committed to transparency, justice, and accountability. The reason he says that is you might remember, and if you didn't, let me remind you that on November 15th, 2023, this was 2 years ago, Christopher Wray, who was then the FBI director, was asked about all the rumors that there were FBI agents in the crowd, and Christopher Wray came with this answer. If you're asking if the violence in the Capitol was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources or agents, the answer is no. But he wouldn't disclose whether or not there were any agents, and of course there were. We all suspected there were, and now we know what they were. Nevertheless, Kash Patel says they were brought in after the fact. I think there were some before, but we'll cover the story as time goes on. But just before I take a break, you might remember that last week we did our truth team, and I think Liberty mentioned it, but I thought I'd give you an update because when we ended on Friday, we were getting close to maybe 55% of our goal, which is good. But if you've ever been listening to Point of View for any length of time, you know that usually we always make our goal. As of what Rob just gave me a few minutes ago, we're now at 60% of our goal. So if you have been one of those individuals that said, well, I meant to send you a gift, I meant to make a phone call, I meant to go online, I thought at least one more day I would mention that. This may be the first time we've not met our goal, and we'll have to figure out what that means. But nevertheless, we had a goal of $150,000, and we've raised $90,000. And so if my math is correct, we've done 60%, and that's good. And I'm not complaining about that, but we're still behind what we hoped we might be. So again, if you want to know more about that, you can certainly go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll see a banner there that has our goal up there. You can click on the button that says Join Now, and you can do the same thing I did yesterday in giving a gift, and I would encourage you to do so. If you would like to talk to someone off air, that number is 800-347-5151. So we go to a break, 800-347-5151, because, again, we would certainly appreciate your financial support. And when we come back, let me get into some other issues. One of those, of course, that we've been covering has to do with what is, in some respects, the remarkable protest and the really concerning protest against some of the ICE agents. And we now have some things that suggest that it's going from dangerous to quite dangerous, and this is why I think we need to cover some of that as well. One of the other articles I've posted for you to read today, and all of them are available at the website. As you go there, you can see my Viewpoints commentary. You can see our Take Action item, which is most appropriate, No Budget, No Pay Act, but also a place where you can make your pledge and help us go over the top and meet our goal. We'll be back right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's get back to this issue of political violence. By the way, if you'd like to join the conversation today, that's the on-air number, 1-800-351-1212. But do want to at least spend just a little bit of time talking about political violence, and I'll take your comments and calls as well. But the first, of course, has to do with the attacks on ICE. And that, I think, should be pretty clear that many of those are politically motivated. But stepping back for just a minute, when we talk about this issue of political violence, and I've been writing about it and we'll have a booklet coming out, I think we should recognize that sometimes when people give us these facts and figures and these statistics, that sometimes people do violent acts, but it isn't necessarily politically motivated. For example, the individual that tried to kill Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley, did not do it for political reasons. He was an individual that was mentally unstable, wasn't even given a prison sentence because he was unbalanced, and we understand that. And on the other hand, the person who killed Martin Luther King Jr. did so because he was a white racist and because he hated black people and he hated the civil rights movement and the rest. And in the next hour, I'm going to have a guest on who has his doctorate in church history, but he's a historian, and I think he would be appalled if he were to read a history book that would argue that Ronald Reagan was assassinated, or the attempted assassination, because of his political views, because that wasn't what was in the mind of the assassin. On the other hand, if he were to read that Martin Luther King Jr. died, but we really don't know what the motive was, I think he'd be appalled there as well. So you can see that when sometimes people say it doesn't matter whether they were left or right, in some cases it doesn't. But if we want to be true to history, that is the case. And it is amazing right now to see most surveys show that a majority of Americans, if asked, think that the person that killed Charlie Kirk was a MAGA person, a so-called extreme right-wing individual. And there are now some of the same things being said about the individual that drove his truck into that Mormon church, killed people, and set the church on fire. And so in some respects, I think trying to discern some of the motive isn't just a fool's errand. I think it is exactly what we need to do if we want to be accurate, not only to history, but understand what is maybe fueling some of that so we can prevent it from happening in the future. With that being said, what we are seeing right now is the attacks on ICE are pretty significant. As we mentioned last week, there was an attack on an ICE facility just 9 miles from where the studio is. I find out that one of my members of my Sunday school class used to work in that building. It turns out that they've now made it an ICE facility because they have a jail in the midst of it. And so, but the door he went in and out up until fairly recently was the door where the individuals were shot. So it brings it a lot closer to home. This brings me to my next article. This is our third article, and that is now Chicago anti-ICE rioters are carrying guns. This was maybe only a one-off, but I'm afraid it might be a preview of other things that might take place. And Ward Clark puts it this way. He said, it's beginning to look a lot like open rebellion in several of the country's major cities. Federal law enforcement is surging into Portland, Oregon. This was written before all the things that happened last night, by the way, to break the Antifa siege of the Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement building there. On Saturday in Chicago, again, what's called a sanctuary jurisdiction, led by one of the mayors, and he says incompetent mayors, Brandon Johnson. This was posed to escalate because on Sunday, the Department of Homeland Security released images of at least 2 handguns seized from these anti-ICE rioters, as well as 1 IED. And so, again, we are dealing with something that seems like an escalation. I don't want to overplay this too much, but I don't want to ignore it either. Let's again read from some of the official statement. Federal law enforcement agents deploying pepper balls and tear gas Friday during a standoff with anti-ICE protesters outside of Chicago. The confrontation came just 2 days after a shooter opened fire at an ICE facility in Dallas, Texas. The gunman in that incident killed one detainee. I've still heard there was two, but that's okay. I'll leave it there. Injured two others before taking his own life. At least 50 protesters were seen midday Friday at an ICE processing center in Broadview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. An ICE spokesperson told Fox News the two were arrested, one of whom was carrying a firearm. Later, they found the other one, and then they found an IED. Now, again, from the photo, you could say, well, this may not be quite like the IEDs, the improved expository devices that were found, say, in Afghanistan or Iraq or places like that. And the individual is quite honest to say, from the photo, it's just speculation. This improved explosive device appears to be a sphere covered with tape, a length of fuse attached to it, the type of fuse used in model rocket launches. Really impossible to tell. It probably would not have been too dangerous, probably would have even emitted more smoke than be explosive, but why do you want to even speculate that it was not a more dangerous thing? Because who knows what's inside that ball? And we recognize that that is significantly dangerous. So it brings us back to this whole issue of political violence that we've talked about before, that there has been sort of a willingness, as long as the riots have been from what would be seen left of center, to go along. And we have posted on our website the op-ed piece by Heather McDonald, which had the question, is rioting acceptable? Then followed it up with the question, if so, how much? If you have the most recent issue of Outlook magazine, and that's one of the many reasons why I would encourage you to think about being a monthly supporter, because we send those Outlook magazines out no matter how much you give. I don't believe there's any limit, but if you give monthly, you'll receive it. Now, again, one of the benefits is if you give $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you receive the booklets. And one of those coming out is on this whole issue of political violence. But as she's pointed out, she has seen time and time again when there have been very violent attacks on ICE. In her article that we've posted, she talks about a couple of those in California where, interestingly enough, the mainstream press didn't even record them. They didn't even report them. And one federal judge did at least acknowledge that there were some stray violent incidents. And so we're living in this world where there's an attempt to sort of move all the way down some of those ideas. And it does seem to me that we are dealing with a situation right now in which we are arguing that words have consequences. We recognize that sometimes when you say that Republicans are racist and fascist, then someone is going to sooner or later go to a ball field where there are Republican members of Congress practicing and try to kill them. And one of those individuals who was shot is Steve Scalise. When you constantly hear that the 2000 election was stolen, sooner or later, and we saw it on January 6th, rioters show up at the Capitol because they're convinced that the election was stolen. If you hear time and time again that Charlie Kirk is a hate monger, sooner or later somebody's going to pick up a rifle and shoot him. And if you hear that ICE is the brown shirts, they are the Gestapo, they are part of this Hitler Nazi fascist regime, and they are the very symbols of evil, sooner or later, and we have seen it, we have seen constant attacks now. In my home state here at Texas, we've had people shot and killed in Dallas. We've seen individuals shot and killed in Alvarado, Texas. We saw an individual shooting and eventually killed in McAllen, Texas. By the time we go to Chicago, we go to Portland, you can begin to see the problem. And so, as we've said before, words have consequences. And as a result, for people to say that they can say anything they want, you know what? We do still believe in free speech. But free speech doesn't mean that you're free from the consequences. And very dangerous speech leads some individuals who are not mentally balanced or who are caught up in the emotion to do some things that are giving us the political violence we're seeing in the streets. We're seeing it on college campuses. We're seeing it in our communities. And so this is one more issue. And this escalation in Chicago should concern everyone. As I've already pointed out, the Secretary of Homeland Security, she and her family have to stay in military situations because of the death threats against her. We'll come back and finish off with some comments about another FBI director right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to spend some time with Dr. Paul Gutacker, and we're going to focus on his book, Practicing Life Together. Second hour, just thought it'd be good to get away from some of the news and issues and all the rest and talk about some things that will help you grow in your Christian life. And so I think you will really benefit from his book and his insight. He's also written a book, which we might bring him back for in the future, The Old Faith in a New Nation, American Protestants and the Christian Christian past. As you know, one of the themes that are going to be running through this year as we come to the 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence is we want to teach some things about our history. There's some very dark chapters in American history. We've talked about that before, and we'll do so again. Slavery, the Indian Wars, whatever. But there are also some very positive things, especially how the church has been very much involved in addressing some of these social issues. His other book is one maybe we'll call on in the future. But this one is just a very practical book on how to really grow as a Christian. And I think this is really important. So we will spend some time talking about that with him in the second hour. But just before we do so, my fourth article is by Victor Davis Hanson because it's about James Comey. Now, James Comey was the FBI director from 2013 to 2017. And it's very good because he reminds us that James Comey faces an indictment, and an indictment is not a conviction. So let's be very clear about what we do know or don't know here. But his real crimes remain untouched. And he uses this to not only talk about James Comey, but some other individuals. And if you go out and read some of the articles right now that are very critical of Donald Trump, and I was reading those the other day saying, well, what we see now is Donald Trump trying to retaliate against his enemies, to try to deal with these individuals in the same way they dealt with him. First of all, I say, well, I'd like to read that because there are some times when I think some actions have been taken by this administration that go too far. And we've talked about that, whether it was the FCC statement, whether the statement by the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, or a variety of others that we've talked about, and we'll talk about more probably on our Friday weekend edition. But it is interesting when you start reading through the articles, nowhere do they talk about where James Comey is innocent of any of this. And so that's why I'm like, okay, if he's not innocent and he is guilty, then at least somewhere in the article I would think you'd say, though we think that Trump is trying to get back at James Comey, there's at least a little bit of an evidence for the fact that this is justifiable. But they never say that because they're so blinded by the disagreement with Donald Trump that they never acknowledge some of the misdoings. And that's one of the reasons why from time to time I bring you Victor Davis Hanson. Remember a couple of Fridays ago when Kelly Shackelford was saying, as we're going through this one piece by Victor Davis Hanson, he says he's bringing up all sorts of things I'd forgotten about. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And I don't know if, first of all, Victor Davis Hanson has a photographic memory. He may. Or whether he has access to the internet, I'm sure he does, or maybe even a Nexus search, which some people have. But he reminds us of quite a number of things. And he says, you know, we recognize that right now, James Comey, what he calls a known fabricator, Andrew McCabe, an admitted liar, are, first of all, disagreeing with one another. So one of them has to not be telling the truth. And you've seen those conversations surface in Congress more than more. But then Victor Davis Hanson says, we know, however, that James Comey's not facing a Trumpian $500 million in potential fines, nor 93 indictments, nor the scrutiny of 5 different local, state, and federal prosecutors. We also know of the crimes or unethical behavior of James Comey are not being investigated or indicted. He's not been charged with pleading amnesia or ignorance in 2018, saying, I didn't know, or I don't recall, I don't remember. I reported 245 times while under oath to House investigators and misleading them. He's not been charged with leaking a 2017 confidential FBI memo of a conversation with then President Trump, which he improperly stored in a personal safe in violation of FBI protocols. Not being charged for falsely assuring the President of the United States in 2017 that he was not the object of the current Crossfire Hurricane Russia collusion investigation, and we now know the president was. He's not being charged for deliberately leaking an FBI memo of a conversation with President Trump for the purpose of injuring him by promoting and prompting the appointment of his friend and predecessor, because he was the former FBI director, Robert Mueller. He's not being investigated for usurping the role of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, in 2016, when as an FBI investigator, he simultaneously was the investigator and the prosecutor, causing a conflict of interest. He's not being investigated for improperly disclosing a newly reopened investigative case against Hillary Clinton on the eve of the 2016 election. He's also not being investigated for giving Peter Strzok to change the original condemnation of Hillary Clinton's conduct by removing the term gross negligence and just putting in the word extreme carelessness, which has no criminal liability. And he goes on to say he's not being investigated for nor charged with birthing the entire government role in the Russian collusion hoax. And so you start going through just all the things having to do with Donald Trump. Now, just for another minute or so, let's talk about some of the others. Because he's not being investigated for attempting in 2017 to entrap or ambush then National Security Advisor designate retired General Michael Flynn by sending 2 FBI agents, including, again, Peter Strzok, to interview him in an attempt to kind of mislead him. And, of course, we had actually interviewed Michael Flynn before he had been tapped by Donald Trump, and then, of course, couldn't interview him after that because then he was under all sorts of investigation. And so he reminds us that we have all sorts of other individuals that maybe are due some kind of investigation. One of those he does mention has been under some investigation. That would be John Bolton. But then he gives us all sorts of other names: Andrew McCabe, James Clapper, because we do know that James Clapper lied under oath with impunity to this Congress and did admit that he did when he swore that the NSA did not spy on American citizens. We know that he did. And even the former CIA director, John Brennan. I encourage you to read it because I've only given you literally the Cliff Notes version, the top level version of that. But it's just as you read through sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence, you realize what we've been through over these last 6 or 7 years. Or if you go all the way back to 2016, even all last 9 years, and you recognize that indeed, when people complain about the indictment of James Comey, there's a lot there, as they like to say. Well, just before we wind down this hour, let me mention again, if you just joined us, that we are at 60%. We probably won't spend much time talking about our finances over the next couple of days, but I thought I'd just mention one more time that we did not make our goal. So even as we go to a break, if you'd like to make that phone call, that number is 800-347-5151. Of course, you can always find it at the website, which is pointofview.net. Just click on that button that says Join Now, and we'd love to hear from you. My commentary today is about food deserts and trying to illustrate again that indeed we have some very significant issues we need to address in this society. One of those is getting food to people, and that's going to be important. But even pointing out how some of these woke policies have actually made the problem worse. That's why we talk about that. Of course, we have our Take Action item and a variety of other resources that you can find at the website at pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to talk about practicing life together. It's time for us to maybe back away for a little bit from some of the news and information, talk about how can we as Christians grow and be more dynamic in our Christian faith. And we'll talk about that with Paul Gutacker right after these important messages.
As you likely know, our nation is approaching its 250th anniversary. And at Point of View, we are on a mission to restore America's godly heritage. But we do need your help. The first step in restoring America's godly heritage is educating people about the biblical truth that shaped our nation, including the truth that God is our creator and the source of our rights, the truth that people, including those in government, are prone to sin, and the truth that freedom requires internal moral guidance, which comes from belief in God. Point of View educates listeners on these truths every day, but we need support from people like you in order to operate. The best way to join in our mission to restore America's godly heritage is by joining the Truth Team. Learn more at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, the Christian life is one in which we practice various kinds of disciplines, or I like to use the idea of rhythms. Sometimes rules and discipline sound a little too harsh, but rhythms of prayer and Sabbath rest, hospitality, Bible study, and the rest. And it seems to me that if we really are serious about growing in the Christian life, some of those disciplines are going to be very helpful. And so we're going to break this down today into 4 parts, and you might be able to take some notes as we talk about gather, pray, study, and discernment. It's all part of this book called Practicing Life Together, A Common Rule for Christian Growth. Dr. Paul Gutacker is the author. Might just mention it is endorsed by people we've had on the program like Alan Jacobs, as well as Thomas Kidd and others. It is published by Moody Press. I think you'll find it very helpful as we sort of dig our way through some of these ideas. He is a historian and received his PhD in history from Baylor University. Also has a master's degree in theological studies and a THM in the history of Christianity from Regent College in Vancouver, BC. Man, it's been years since I've been up there. And also as an author of a book, which we might talk about sometime in the future as we're talking about our 250th anniversary coming up to the Declaration of Independence. His book, Old Faith in a New Nation, American Protestants and the Christian Past. Individual that has really wanted to not only study history, but try to make some of these ideas practical. And you can find those in his 200-page book, 12 chapters, Practicing Life Together. Dr. Paul Gutacker, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. It's a real treat to talk with you today.
You know, one of the things that I just mentioned a minute ago is when we talk about rules, everybody goes, okay, that's legalism. And you came up with an illustration early on in your book that I may start using, and I think we should, and that is the idea of the trellis. If you've ever raised tomatoes, and I live in Texas, so we sort of strip mine them down here, but you get some really good tomatoes up north. You still recognize whatever you're doing, sooner or later, you need a trellis. If you have a grape orchard, you need a trellis. And in some respects, I love that illustration, and that's something as a theme that runs through your book, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. You know, I think people hear rule, and the first thing that comes to mind is a list of do's and don'ts that, you know, if you don't check every box, you'll get in trouble. And I think that the older sense of the word, it comes from the Latin regula. It means standard or measuring stick. It's more about, you know, what's the standard that you want to try to aim for? And a rule of life is less about, hey, here are all the things that you can't do or you have to do. It's more of a structure. It's a way of saying, this is the direction that I want my life to go in. This is the way of growth that would be fruitful. So if you just let your tomato plants go anywhere they want, and I've done this, I've made this mistake, you're not going to get a lot of fruit. You're going to get a big tangled mess. But a trellis, a structure, helps aim the plant in the right direction. And that's really all a rule of life is. It's being intentional about direction.
Well, I encourage people maybe to number 1 to 4, but number 1 is the idea of gather, learning to be together. And it seems to me that the first issue we're dealing with here is that we in North America are probably much more individualistic, and yet you talk about life together, learning to be together, the gift and the challenge of community. And it does seem to me that certain church traditions have been stronger of emphasizing community. And if I look at the idea of the scriptures, this koinonia that we have in the New Testament, that is certainly what should be our model, shouldn't it?
Oh, exactly. I mean, there's no question that the gospel is personal. It's not just something that you kind of can collectively inherit. It's something, it's a relationship, a personal relationship, but it's always the case that to be joined to Christ, to be in relation to Christ, is to be in relation to his body. I think, Kerby, about Acts 2, we have this incredible moment. The Holy Spirit descends on the church. Peter gives this incredible sermon, and thousands respond, right? It says in Acts 2 that thousands were added to their number. And then what do? What sort of evidence of their transformation do we see? It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And then just a few verses later, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. It seems to me that what the gospel does is transform us, not just as individuals, but it turns us into a people, to delight, to share in life together, to gather around the table, to give thanks to God. This seems characteristic of gospel life.
Sure. And again, you talk about feeding, fasting, and feasting, I guess you might talk about. But I thought one other aspect that I appreciate you adding was what you call the rule of St. Benedict. Now, Benedict was kind of in a monastic order, but his first rule and the opening word was listen. And it does seem to me that that's a part of community. And I will tell the story of the fact that sometimes I have co-hosts, and I will notice that sometimes the co-host will, after I've asked a question of a guest, ask the very same question, which is obvious that individual, and maybe some listeners can point out sometime when I ask the same question somebody just answered. So, it's possible. Listening is really important. And sometimes people say, well, you're a talk show host, you must be able to talk. I said, no, there's a lot of listening. Even now, I want to listen to your comments because it seems to me that he talks about a life of listening, and that's another part of community that I think we've lost.
I think that's so right. I mean, listening is much more than just waiting for the other person to stop talking, And if it's always been a challenge to pay attention to the person in front of us, I think that's always been the case. How much more so these days when we're so distracted.
Oh, yes.
And when there's all these things that tug our attention away from other people. And we all know that there's something missing when we can't really attend to the person in front of us. I mean, I think we've all seen this in a coffee shop or a restaurant where you've got a parent or a family with their kids and everybody's on their phones. And yet, I judge other people for doing that, and I find myself struggling with that too. Real listening, really paying attention to someone it's a sacrifice. It's actually a gift to give them that.
Very good. Let me just mention this first section. We could really just give a whole set of sermons on it, but I want to make sure that you get an overview of the entire book. And there are 4 sections, but this first one, Gather, Learning to Be Together, talks about the importance of everything from communion to weekly dinners and all sorts of very practical things. And if you want to grow in your Christian life, I think you're going to benefit quite a bit from each one of these sections. But since we have 4 segments and we have 4 sections to the book, when we come back, we're going to talk about the issue of praying, because that gets us into also learning to listen and maybe living within the rhythms. There's another one of my words, rhythms in prayer. It's all part of this wonderful book, Practicing Life Together, A Common Rule for Christian Growth. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for more than a decade, policymakers have been discussing the problem of food deserts. I started writing about this issue 3 years ago because there are zip codes of low-income neighborhoods without a grocery store that can provide fresh and nutritious food options. Dr. Merrill Matthews recently wrote about this issue and was on my radio program to discuss it. He reminds us that the major food chains like Walmart, Kroger, and Whole Foods have announced that they are leaving some major urban areas. Of course, we've also seen other retail outlets that don't sell food that are also leaving those same crime-ridden areas. The explanation is simple. They have become bastions of progressivism. Crime is on the increase because shoplifters and other criminals aren't punished. Record levels of unchecked theft and crime make the stores unprofitable. So let me add my perspective to his observation. Food deserts are a real problem, and wokeness, and especially critical race theory, make the problem worse. In a recent speech I gave in the Dallas area, I started with the economic fact that it takes $12 million to plant a grocery store in the region, and the risks are high given the limited profit margins. In 2 cities in which I've lived, the local grocery store went broke and closed. When a food chain announces that it will locate a grocery store, there are the inevitable charges of racism. A white grocery chain will put local black convenience stores out of business. Once it is built, the food chain must hire law enforcement to stop shoplifting and smash and grab. Again, you hear the charges of racism. And if only a few people are hired from the community, once again, you hear the charges of racism. So food deserts are a real problem, but I suggest that the current political, economic, and cultural issues aren't making it easier to solve the problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Paul Gutacker. His book is entitled Practicing Life Together, A Common Rule for Christian Growth. It is published by our friends at Moody Press. And, of course, that first section is one that I really would commend to you, Gather, Learning to Be Together. But, Paul, I thought for just a minute we might talk about pray, learning to listen. We already talked about this idea of listening, but again, speaking with God, a life of prayer, keeping time, living in rhythms of prayer, and then practicing common prayer. It does seem to me that certain traditions, certain denominations maybe work better at this. One of those, which you talk about here, is the church calendar. We've done a program or two from another individual that was certainly addressing those issues. But in terms of whether it's worship or prayer, there are some seasons and some rhythms, and that's something that you talk about in that particular section, right?
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's interesting that we see really early in Christian history, the church is very small. It's a tiny minority in the Roman Empire. And really from the very earliest records we have, we can see that it mattered to early Christians to observe special seasons and holy days, that the way that identity forms is through memory and how we mark time. This is why, when people want to sort of change people's identity, think of revolutionary France, right? We want to make France totally post-Christian. We want to worship reason. They had to change the calendar. They tried, and it failed, right?
That's true.
Because we know how we mark time, how we observe seasons. These shape our imaginations, They tell us who we are. And so it's not a surprise then that early Christians really cared about how to commemorate, how to mark the sacred seasons of the year, remembering Christ's passion and death and resurrection, remembering his birth. And I think the church calendar is just a wonderful way of saying, how can we reshape our imagination from all the values of the world and the secular calendar to the story of the gospel. That's all it is. It's reenacting that story year in and year out and letting it shape who we understand ourselves to be.
One of the conversations we had many, many years ago, which really influenced our conversation about rhythm, is you have a couple of different words, chronos and kairos. And chronos is kind of the time, and then kairos is kind of God's time, or kind of this celebration. And there is a sense in which we are disconnected from a lot of rhythms. For example, why 24-hour days? Well, that's the rotation of the earth. Why 365 days a year? Well, that's the orbit of the earth around the sun. Why is it we have different seasons, and the rhythm of the seasons, whether it's Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, whatever it might be, that all kind of comes together usually when we talk about worship. But you have a whole section in your book talking about prayer. Can you explain how that comes together?
Yeah, absolutely. This rhythm, I think, helps us. We're creatures that are made for rhythm, right? Our bodies have a rhythm. We wake and we sleep. We crave habit. We crave routine. And I think the church calendar can invite us in our prayer to focus on different key aspects of our life with God. So it's a little hard to pay attention to everything at once, right? To try to always be perfectly balanced and cover all your bases. And that's why it's good to have a season, for example, in Lent, that's really devoted to serious self-examination and repentance. We're reminded that we're going to die, and in light of that, how ought we to live? What is the Lord inviting us to turn away from and turn to himself? So I need to repent all year round. Let's be honest, but it helps to have a season where I'm going to pay special attention to that for weeks at a time. And then when Easter comes, to turn my attention from myself and my own sinfulness to the greater goodness, the greater power of Christ's victory over sin and death. And I just think that this kind of rhythm helps us have a more full-fledged life of prayer. If I'm just trying to remember every day, every week to pray about everything, honestly, it's going to be a little bit more shallow. But if I'm invited by the church calendar to focus my prayer and to focus my attention, I'm more likely to go deeper.
One of the things that I noticed in the publicity for your book was the idea that this would probably be helpful for emerging adults, the next generation, 20-somethings, 30-somethings. We do quite a bit on this program with Generation Y, millennials, Generation Z, and that is certainly the case. But it also occurs to me, Paul, that there are a good number of those in that generation, and I think all of us at any age can learn this, that have never been in church. And so you have a whole section on practicing common prayer. That is almost unfamiliar territory for a lot of individuals listening to this program right now. So how does that come together? How can you get started? And what does that maybe do in terms of your own Christian growth?
Oh, I think it's so essential. It's interesting that Jesus says in Matthew 18, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in the midst of them. And this isn't to say that you can't pray on your own, that there's no place for solitude or for private devotion or for time with just the Lord. But something special happens when more than one person in the body of Christ comes together, and he promises to be present in a special way when we pray with each other. I like to think of it as prayer together is a way of fulfilling the injunction to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We can lift each other up when I'm distracted or my prayer is dry, when I don't have the right words, when I don't exactly know even what to ask for, someone else can lift me up. And we can carry each other in prayer to the Lord. So, I would say to somebody who's not experienced this, who's not been part of a church or a vibrant Christian community, even starting small with a practice of once a week gathering with one or two others just to pray and to pray scripture together, to lift each other up. This can really be, I think, transformative and can become a special part of our growth with the Lord.
One of the things that you talk about is solitude and silence. I've just been preaching through at the moment in my own Sunday school class, Mark, and there's a place where he's healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and then everybody's looking for Jesus, and it says that he left, and they all want to bring him back to, of course, everybody's in town, everybody's looking for you, and he then says, let me go, because indeed I need to go and preach to others also. But it says that he got up early in the morning while it was still dark. Simon and his companions are looking for him, and yet he, in the midst of busyness, found the time for solitude and prayer. So just as we talked about corporate prayer and common prayer, there's another aspect of that, and that's solitude, isn't there?
That's totally right. There's various ways in which the life of discipline, of spiritual discipline, involves saying yes to things that are good and no to things that are less good. So think of fasting. We don't fast because food is bad, but because the Word of God is better. And so we deprive ourselves for a time of what we need so we can hunger for God. And I think solitude is like that. It's not that community is bad, but we can use any good thing to keep ourselves from introspection, from time with the Lord, from real deep prayer. And so that means, the Christian tradition has always said that a good counterpart to our life together is times of deliberate solitude. And I just think, Kerby, on this point, that's so hard to find these days.
So true.
It's not going to happen by accident. I'm not going to accidentally find myself in a given week having a quiet time of solitude with the Lord unless I plan on it. And this is one of the gifts of a rule of life, is you can say, you know what, I need that. I'm going to intend to do that to the best of my ability, even if it's just a half an hour a week. We need those times to be silent, to be still, to not be on our devices, and to be just in the presence of the Lord.
Yeah. And I mentioned Paul and Paige have 4 children, so trying to find solitude is sometimes very difficult. We do need to take a break, and we've talked about this idea of gather and pray. When we come back, we're going to talk about study and discern. It's all part of this book, Practicing Life Together, a common rule for Christian growth. I think you will benefit from the book. We have information about it on our website in case you can't find it in your local bookstore. If you can support your local bookstore, do so. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to find it either in paperback or Kindle, and it would certainly help your Christian growth. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll be right back and cover more right after these messages.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the book Practicing Life Together, a common rule for Christian growth, and we've talked about certainly gather and pray. And Paul, for just a minute, I thought we might also just talk about how people can use this. You have 12 chapters, and people could certainly just read through each one of those, but it does seem to me that if you want to do life together, this could be a 12-week study that small groups or life groups could possibly do. Certainly individuals can read through this and apply it, but the way you've put it together, you even have additional resources people can pursue. It seems to me that you put that together both for individual study as well as for group study.
Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, these things are always better when you can talk with other people about them, right? And so Moody, I've been really happy with what they've done. They've put together a discussion guide with me that's freely available on their website. So if you just go to the book page on moodypublishers.com, you can get that discussion guide. But I think the ideal way to read this book is probably the same as any book, which is do it with others, gather together, talk about it, wonder together, question together, and that's when real deep learning can happen.
Well, again, 4 sections. We'll go through to part 3 now. That is study. Learn to wonder. Loving the Lord with all your mind, the life of study. That's certainly what we talk about so often here on Point of View. Our inheritance, receiving the gift of tradition, and practice reading together. The first one is this idea of wonder. This, I think, is significant. And again, there is a need for us, as you point out, to have curiosity. But you also talk about the problem of curiosity and maybe even the problem with the way in which we do our education. Can you explain?
Yeah, curiosity is one of these funny words where I think what we mean when we say it today is something closer to wonder. You think of a curious child who wants to understand something. But the old definition of this that, in the ancient world that the Christian tradition critiqued was this idea of seeking to sort of grasp and own new knowledge for your own benefit. Mm-hmm. So trying to flip from one thing to the next, to be the person who is known as one who knows things, or the person who can say, oh yeah, I've read those books. And the problem with that for Christian thinkers like Augustine is that it's all about the self.
Yes.
All of the knowledge seeking is for one's own benefit, whereas genuine study, genuine wonder, is based on the idea that everything we can know is given to us as a gift. That God actually knows everything, and the extent to which we know something, it's because we participate or share in what God knows. And I think this classical understanding of the problem with curiosity is really troubling because our education system today is premised on this vice. It's premised on the idea that the only real reason to try to know something is for what you can get out of it for yourself.
Yeah. Well, there's another part of that, and that goes to a question you ask of one of your Brazos fellows. I might just mention that as a community that you have that studies, prays, eats, discerns together, and that is, why should I study more theology? And that question, I think, for a person that has not gone to seminary, has not gone to Bible college, maybe even a new Christian is like, well, I don't really need to do theology. That's kind of what you guys do. That's for the super smart people. Yeah. That's for the intelligentsia. And of course, we have this unfortunate gap between the clergy and the laity that's just reinforced. And that's why you again emphasize that we all should be students and we all should study.
I do. And, I think the reason to study theology is simply to love the Lord. We're commanded to love the Lord with our heart, our soul, and our mind. And I think one of the unfortunate byproducts of this way of thinking about study is just for the professionals, for the academics or for the pastors, is that we've underestimated the way in which ordinary literate Christians can benefit in their walk with God by studying the things of God. And this doesn't have to be formal study necessarily or pursuing a degree. In fact, it might be better for some of us if it's just for the love of it. But C.S. Lewis is really good on this. C.S. Lewis wrote a preface to a book by Athanasius on the Incarnation, and he celebrates this classic theological text because he says ordinary Christians can read it, and they ought to. It ought to be more normal for people who say we love the Lord to give our attention, to give our time to learning more about who he is and the world he's made. And so I think we just need to normalize that theological study, theological reading, certainly studying Scripture, that this is part of normal Christian life.
One of the other issues that you talk about in terms of our inheritance is receiving the gift of tradition. And you're reading about tradition, you turn the page, and you're talking about cooking. Learn to cook, tradition as freedom. And I think the good point that you're making there is no one should ever learn to cook entirely on their own. Cooking is a basic human activity, something all humans do. But cooking is necessarily cultural and social. It requires belonging in a tradition. And there's a sense in which you use that as an illustration. Just as we earlier talked about a trellis that maybe is a better word than rule, there's a sense in which when we get into this idea of tradition, sometimes we have the older generation, even some of the younger generation saying, well, tradition, that's kind of taken us the wrong direction. But there is a value in learning what has come before you, isn't there?
Totally. One of the fallacies we have is that we're most free when we can strip away all of the things we've inherited, the tradition, the community, the old things, the people who've come before, and just be ourselves. I mean, this is the plot of every Disney movie, right? Just be yourself. Well, you're actually less free, biblically speaking, when you just follow whatever your impulses and whims are. You're more free when you give yourself to habits, to disciplines. Think of the person who decides, I'm going to wake up today, I've never run, but I want to run a marathon. How free are they to do that? Well, they can't, right? The person who's never been trained in a culinary tradition, who's never learned from a mother or a grandparent or a cookbook how to cook, is not more free to cook a delicious meal. They're probably going to make something that makes you feel sick or kills you. So this dichotomy between tradition as constraining and dead and stagnant and true freedom, it actually doesn't hold up to the way that it works to be human, the way that culture works. And so I think in a time when we have a great distrust of tradition and of anything old, we need to recover this sense of the gift of everything we inherit. Not that it's perfect, not that there's not problems, there are things that we need to occasionally reform or grow in, but that what we have inherited is what makes true creativity and freedom and life possible.
One other point that you make is practicing reading together, which I never really thought about, although I do that in some situations in which you pick a book of the Bible, study together, read a psalm together, maybe even take a particular book and have a book study or something of that nature. But there is a sense in which, again, that brings you together with community, gives you insights you wouldn't have if you just picked up the book on your own.
That's right. And you mentioned the name Alan Jacobs earlier. And I've learned so much from him on this, just the way in which we can think of reading old books and reading the sort of great tradition. We can think of this as a way of pulling our chair up to a table and allowing the dead to speak. And when we do that, when we think with other people, both literally in the room as we read and think together, but also allowing those who've gone before us to raise their voice, when we do that, we really expand who we are and how we understand our time and what God is calling us to. So I think, again, you don't have to necessarily go get another degree. You don't have to become a professional scholar, but the human desire to use our mind to understand the truth more, we can really cultivate this if we do it together.
So good. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into our fourth and final section, discern, learning to attend, preparing to die, living our vocation, hearing his voice, a lifelong project of discernment, practicing Sabbath. And again, if you find yourself saying, this might be a book that I would like to work through, first of all, as I mentioned, 12 chapters, then a whole section that is put together on further resources. And as Paul just mentioned a minute ago, you can also go to the page that Moody Press has for this book, and you can find some other things that you could use if you wanted to study it in a group setting. So there's some great resources. Practicing Life Together, a common rule for Christian growth. And again, it's a resource that we have information about on our website at pointofview.net. So simply click on that button that says See More. Click on it, and you can find out more about the book. And if you can find it in your local bookstore, purchase it there. If not, we have a chance for you to pick it up either in paperback or Kindle. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the book is entitled Practicing Life Together. Paul Gutacker is with us, and the book is dealing now with the issue of discern, learning to attend. And I love all the D's that you have here, because you talk about division, dissent, disease, desperation, disentangling. It does seem to me that in some respects, this whole idea of living our vocation and even learning to die is part of the Christian life, and it's something we've sort of forgotten about.
Yeah, we sometimes use the word vocation just to mean, whatever I want to do for work that'll make the most money, and let me spiritualize that. But at its heart, biblically speaking, vocation, it just means the calling, right? And it's the call to follow Christ. So I think when we think about discerning vocation, what we really need to think about is, how am I called to follow Christ to the cross? And I think here what really helps us discern this is the faithful Christians who've gone before us, that the Christian saints of the past can give us a model for what it looks like to follow Christ. And this is because God has made us to grow through imitation, right? If you want to learn how to be a great cook, well, you got to work with a great cook. If I want to learn how to be a great deer hunter, I got to hang out with my brother-in-law, Lewis, because we learn how to do things well through imitation. And that's why we see in Scripture and in the Christian tradition that we're meant to look to our fellow Christians for models of following Christ. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." When we follow someone who's following Christ, we learn how to live out our vocation.
Well, again, imitate me, he says. You also, of course, talk about, we have such a great cloud of witnesses in Hebrews 12. We, of course, have this whole idea of the communion of the saints, so many of those things. And as I said, even as a parent, you're raising children right now, kids are sort of values vacuum cleaners. They just pick up your values from who you are. And so it does seem to me that that is part of your calling and your vocation. But you also talk about hearing his voice, the lifelong project of discernment. If there's a word that maybe I use too often here on Point of View, it's the word discernment. But at a time when so many voices, this cacophony of voices is coming to us from various sources, whether it's our smartphones, our media, our television, our friends, neighbors, coworkers, whatever it might be, there is a great need for discernment. And you talk about how we need to have discernment really as a way of life.
I think we do, and we usually need help with that, right? So, of course, we have Scripture and prayer, but I think there's also other things that the Lord can use to help us discern. It might be spiritual friendship, right? A real trusted friend who knows who you really are, who's not afraid to speak truth to you. It might be a wise mentor or pastor, but we have to do this work of ongoing self-examination, not because we're meant to be, endlessly anxious or striving or legalistic, but just because we're never done in this life of that process of growth. And so I think discernment is a practice. It's not a thing we complete and graduate from, but it's a way of life. It's a way of following Christ to the cross.
One last point that I thought we'd make, and then get some opportunity for you to give us a summary, and that is practicing Sabbath. We've talked about that before, but it does seem to me that this idea of the Sabbath rest is important, even the idea of the gift of the Sabbath, and let us keep the feast, even the radical idea of going to church and learning to practice the Sabbath in a way that honors God is certainly very significant, which again, in this fast-paced, frenetic society, is difficult to do.
Yeah, it is. It's good news to be told that the world keeps spinning, even without our work, that God is God and that we are his creatures. And Sabbath, I think, biblically speaking, points to that God made a good world. He wants to dwell in it, right? He comes on the seventh day to rest, which is the language of indwelling. And he invites us into his rest. So this is both, we look back to creation, but we also look forward to the eternal rest that we're promised, a Sabbath day when we'll be with the Lord. And every week we get the chance to enter into that truth by letting go of productivity, of achievement, by just receiving the gift of rest and of worship with God's people. We're reminding ourselves that our ultimate value, our ultimate identity is not found in what we can accomplish, but in who God is and the life that he freely gives to us.
You talked about all through the book of the importance of saying no to time and money. And this is one I hadn't thought about. First, we give up control of our time by ceasing from work. Okay, that makes sense. But the second one was very insightful. Second, we give up the control of our money by giving. And you know as well as I do, and we've had George Barna, and I have a book or two that gets into the lack of giving on the part of Christians. And so there is a sense in which I'd never really tied the idea of Sabbath to certainly our time, that makes sense, but even to our money. And it does seem to me that that's another way in which we have discernment and we honor the Lord.
I think so. We are creatures who crave to control our own life. I think this is, part of the original sin of Adam and Eve is they wanted to grasp control. And I think Sabbath teaches us to let go of that a little at a time. And that includes our money, right? That all of it comes from the Lord. The Lord has more than we need and promises to provide for us, right? And, Christ says, why are you so concerned about tomorrow? Look at how I clothe the flowers of the field and feed the birds of the air. So when we give generously, when we tithe, these are ways of remembering and reminding ourselves that the Lord provides, that we don't need a backup plan as if somehow he's going to let us down, but that we can freely offer back to him what belongs to him to begin with. And this is a radical thing. I mean, that if you regularly go to church, if you regularly give, you're actually doing a radical kind of Christianity given the numbers. And so I hope that this part of the book really invites young adults to take seriously that this is a way of following Christ that's faithful and also radical.
Well, again, I just appreciate you writing the book. And again, if people want to contact you, of course, you can be easily contacted through the various book resources, including some of the material provided by Moody Publishers. And of course, we would encourage people to consider practicing life together. And again, Paul, I appreciate you giving us some time today on this book and look forward to maybe a future opportunity.
Thanks so much, Kerby. I appreciate talking with you.
Again, the book is one that I think you should be able to find in your local bookstore. If you think about this, the Christian life really is one of discipline or of rhythm or even of a trellis. I love that illustration there. And so if you're thinking about how to gather, to pray, to study, to show discernment, I think this is a book that might be very helpful to you. Even if not, you certainly need to think about where, in some cases, you can gather with others to eat together, to pray together, to study Scripture together, to practice Sabbath together. We are a group of individuals sometimes that are so isolated, and we need community. And so this is why I think this would be a great resource for you. Practicing Life Together came out in September, published by our friends at Moody Press. And so I hope that you will check it out, and you can do so by going to the website, which is pointofview.net. Again, want to thank both Megans for their help producing the program today, engineering it, and I certainly want to thank my producer, Steve, for producing the program. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
As you likely know, our nation is approaching its 250th anniversary. And at Point of View, we are on a mission to restore America's godly heritage. But we do need your help. The first step in restoring America's godly heritage is educating people about the biblical truth that shaped our nation, including the truth that God is our creator and the source of our rights. The truth that people, including those in government, are prone to sin, and the truth that freedom requires internal moral guidance, which comes from belief in God. Point of View educates listeners on these truths every day, but we need support from people like you in order to operate. The best way to join in our mission to restore America's godly heritage is by joining the Truth Team. Learn more at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.